All right, guys. Thank you, anyone who's joining right now. We have 0 people, so that makes it very easy. So, um, for the recording purposes, we are going to be doing the very first interview of the channel's live stream. So, anyone who's joining, we're going to be really fortunate to be joined by a couple characters today. We're going to be joined by Eric Estlund of Winter Cutlery, and I believe also my good friend Kyle Smith of Alientude. Alientude's channel's the famed sword reviewer. So we're going to try and keep it pretty concise. I think that we'll try and stick to around an hour altogether. So without further ado, let's see if I can add my friends to the stage. I see Eric and Kyle. Let me know if you guys can hear me okay, since I think we probably only have 1 or 2 viewers. Eric, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sound is good.
Sound is good for you as well. Kyle, how are you doing tonight?
Good. How about you?
Hey, you're coming in A-okay. We got the gang together. Let me see if I can do this. Look at that. We have a tropical lagoon. Technology works. All right, guys. This is experimentation in action. And even if it's just the 3 of us talking about swords, I think we can still have a good night of it. So I'm experimenting with this microphone here. So if you hear me making a big fuss, or if I start screaming at you, just yell at me and I'll stop talking and just let you guys talk amongst yourselves. So we are obviously going to be talking about swords. I have a couple swords behind me I can bring out on camera as need be. But Eric, I wanted this to be a case to showcase you and your line of winter cutlery. I'm just going to very quickly put on the screen
Sure.
your website here. And I like to pride myself on knowing about swords and sword makers, although I don't specialize in looking at in knowing every individual commission smith. And I think you actually reached out to me once upon a time, months ago, years ago, what have you. I think
Yeah.
Kyle put us together, and I wasn't particularly familiar with your work at that time. And since then, I have become familiar with your work, and I've been very, very impressed. What can you tell us about where you come from, why you are doing this? Because when I Google
Sure.
Eric Estlund, I come up with a bunch of bicycles, and I'm very confused.
Yeah. So no, that's fantastic. Yeah. Well, just to address the bicycle thing, I was a custom bicycle frame builder and designer for about 15, 17 years, something like that. So that's where a lot of if people know my name, that's usually where it's from. And certainly a lot of my clientele, I've been lucky that a lot of the bike guys are also knife guys. So that's been great. Yeah, I did that for a long time. And some of the similarities that overlap with the knife and the sword stuff, you know, all of those objects are very kinetic. There's a real strong connection between how a human body works and how a human mind works, and then the thing that I was making, be that a bike or a knife or a sword. So that interplay between sort of cold metal work and the people that use it has always been interesting to me. And in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I started making knives pretty much as a side to the bike business, out of personal interest. And then a number of years ago now, I decided that I wanted to start making swords, long time personal interest. And I knew right from the get-go that I wanted to make swords as a sword builder as opposed to just big knives like a knife maker, which isn't to knock anybody's work, but I think there's a real distinction between some of the modern swords that are produced as art objects that share more with modern American sort of knife making from an aesthetic standpoint and from scale and things like that, which I think is fantastic. And there's a lot of beautiful, very high level work. But I was interested in more of a historical sword. These were objects that were used outside of art context as well as in an art context historically. And I wanted to bring some of my metalworking experience and some of my sword experience from various fencing and the early HEMA use and things like that, and start working that. So I do both now. I do kind of in my head, I sort of separate them with modern knives. I do a lot of EDCs, sort of pocket-sized fixed blades and things like that. And then I have a real strong focus on the historical end of swords and daggers, mostly European.
That's great. I love the telling us how you started and what drew you to swords, and the distinction. I especially appreciate the distinction about how you started with knives and then moved to swords, because I do feel that, just like you discussed, there are a lot of knife makers who are perhaps interested in exploring the sword space or want to go from knife making to sword making. There's a bit of a joke on the channel that I think you touched on, where you can often tell if a sword's been produced by a knife maker. And I didn't get that from you, but I think that the reason for that, the crux of that, is your approach to sword making, your approach to producing it from a historical in the historical context behind, or historical sword making. And again, there are all sorts of different sword makers out there. And this is something that I want to get into a little bit, because, I'm both myself and Kyle have swords that you have sent out for review, and we'll have a chance to discuss that in a little bit. And Kyle, you of course can ask questions of Eric as well in a minute. But I just want to get this quick point out. When someone is going to seek out a smith to do a custom piece, I know I get questions all the time. Folks are coming to my channel and they want to buy their first sword, or they have an idea in their head about, all right, I have this idea for a perfect sword that's going to be an awesome custom piece, and they want to bring it to life. They often don't necessarily know where to go or who to seek out. And oftentimes smiths are very, very adept, but in a kind of narrow, just part of the spectrum of sword making. It's not to say that they can't branch out. Some guys only want to do rapiers. Some guys only want to do Japanese stuff. Other guys are good at fantastical pieces. You have guys that are doing spectacular things that are functional, but are not necessarily rooted in history. And other guys maybe play a little bit loosey-goosey and don't spend that much time doing their work on what things were done, how things were done in the past. If someone were knocking on your doorstep, or I should say, why would they seek you out as a maker? What distinguishes your work? Why might they want to seek you out as a smith?
Yeah, well, I think kind of even before that, from a customer perspective, and this was the same in bikes and the same in any handmade good where there's variation in the market. I think rather than just trying to find either the first custom smith or the first custom builder in your area, or the first person that hits your price range, or whatever your criteria are, really look at the body of work that person is producing, and see if it jives, at least on some level, with what you're interested in. Now, that's not to say pigeonhole a builder, right? Like, I think it's always a good idea to reach out and ask. A lot of us work in kind of an artistic space as well as a functional space. And the idea of being able to push outside of what we normally do is sometimes interesting. But most makers are going to have a range in which they're comfortable pushing that. So yeah, I think as a custom builder, have an idea of who's out there, and that's going to take some research on your end. I know there's some forum information with that. I'm relatively new to the market as far as a name that people are familiar with swords. So there's other guys like me that are out there maybe doing good work that you just haven't heard of, but it's worth investigating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I think that's a place to start from, is sort of see who you feel like, oh wow, this resonates with me, as opposed to just like, oh, I found Swordmaker X who's willing to take on the commission. In my experience, people that are only sort of guns for hire might produce exactly what you're asking for, which could be fantastic. But if you go to somebody who has their own place of experience, their own aesthetic, and their own design philosophy, you might get more than you're asking for. Just because of their experience. So that's just a place where I think test the waters out. You know, if I certainly do some like straight commission work. I very rarely, not even very rarely, I don't take on work where somebody hands me a drawing and says, please build this. I'm not interested in that type of work, which isn't to say there aren't builders who are. I'm not. Even for the commission work that I take on, I want to have effectively a creative overview so that I can do work that I think is holistically designed as a functional piece, even if it has a mostly aesthetic direction or impetus from a client. You know, I don't mind building pieces that hang on the wall and are never used for cutting, but I want my work to have at least a functional base. So, you know, when you come to me, I want to have effectively creative direction and take some input and work with somebody to build something that is what they want, but is also very much a piece of mine.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. Great. I think that's pretty concise. Eric, Kyle, it looks like you had something you'd like to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, at least with my experience commissioning, one of the things you should look for is somebody who is passionate about the project that you are pitching. You know, there might be people who would take it just because they want the money and they need the money and they want to get the thing, but look for somebody who is excited by your idea, who wants to push themselves to do it, and whose work you admire also, of course. Don't just, you know, oh, there's a bladesmith, let me commission him. Look into him first, you know, look at his work, look at his history, and then, like I said, pitch it to him. But realize that most high-end makers want exactly what Eric said, want a degree of control. They want to put their own stamp on it because it's representative of them. They put their heart and soul into their work, and you're not going to get that heart and soul if they're just doing a straight copy of what you say.
Yeah, and I think there's, you know, just to touch on a little point that I made earlier, you know, if I were just to make a draft for somebody or make a sword based on their draft, you know, that's technically, if it's within my capacity, that's a relatively easy thing to do. I think generally speaking, most, and this isn't universal, but most buyers of any handmade object have a really good idea of what they want. They don't necessarily have a full idea of the scope of what's available. And that can be aesthetic things, it can be handling things, it can be all manner. And so the ability to work with somebody who gets what you want and understands what you're asking for, but also has the ability and the sort of the creative confidence to say, but I think it might be a little bit better if I do this based on my experience. And I think going to a builder that has that level of confidence, whether it's me or somebody else, generally I think those little tweaks are something that you should be listened to, even if ultimately as a project and a collaborator and a buyer, maybe things shift. You know, I think it's worth at least having a conversation if somebody's going to make a bespoke piece in that kind of way.
I wonder how much of that it comes up to the experience of the buyer. I could be entirely wrong about this. Going off of previous just history of giving recommendations, I find that oftentimes folks that are relatively young in their sword collecting career tend to get very lost in the weeds about the details, and they might have something in mind and they have very specific ideas in their head, and they try and do a lot of the backseat driving in the construction process. Whereas, you know, I might have, you know, more than 50 swords in my room right now, and if I were going to do the commission, if I were going to commission a sword, not even just pick up a sword from a custom smith, I would to me, I would probably just have very loose guidelines and have the expectation that if I'm already visiting a smith whose body of work I appreciate, I would trust them to know what they're doing and be able to execute on the details that they need to do.
Yeah, and I certainly, again, I'm not going to speak for the vast range of people that do this type of work, but if you're interested in having, so I sell work that is pre-made. That's predominantly what I do, is I make things that I'm interested in, that I've researched, that I sort of touch on a niche that I'm interested in, and then put them for sale when they're ready.
Yeah.
I also do commission work. I do commission work directly, and then I have some commission work coming in through Dragon's Breath Forge as well. And for those pieces, I expect a certain degree of client direction, but I also, if I'm the guy that is going to build it, again, I expect a certain degree of freedom, both in the design. So, if we're talking about a functional cutter, if they have experience, fantastic. We'll play with that. But I still want to have ultimately a fair chunk of, again, the overview of the project. And if that doesn't work for a buyer, that's no problem. We can figure out somebody else that's a better match for them. I'd rather have people happy I turn them down than unhappy customers with swords.
Now, Eric, have you ever made a wall hanger? Have you ever made a sword that can't function as a functional sword?
So not really. I think most of my stuff, if it looks like well, I'm going to back up. I have never started a project with the intention of it being a wall hanger, like an artistic fantasy piece. Which, again, I'm not necessarily against from an artistic standpoint. And I actually kind of get a kick out of objects that have an obvious, their look shows a function, but they're unable to do that function. That's sort of a long time artistic interest of mine. But as far as swords, I have made swords that have failed. And usually I catch that pretty early in the process, like let's say I blow a fuller line or something.
Yeah.
But rather than bringing it to completion as a B product, usually I'll take that piece of material and try to learn something about it. Push it to being purely recycling, but learn something technical from what I've been doing. So yeah, I don't really do B product. I make a small enough amount of stuff, and I spend so much time on it that I'd rather remake a guard 3 times and put one on I don't like. I'm fortunate to be in a position that I can do that.
Yeah. And again, we have some people joining the channel right now, and I think all 3 of us probably have examples of Eric's handiwork somewhere in their household. Up here, let me see if I'm going to bully everyone off the screen real fast. So this is an example. This is one of the messers that he was kind enough to send me, and this is some. I don't know what everyone's aesthetic is, but to me, this is a beautiful piece. Both the steel and the leather that it's clad in, and it is not only gorgeous, but it is also highly functional. This is an incredibly functional piece of kit for a short sword. So far from a wall hanger, but gorgeous both in the buy knife and the main sword, the main messer here, and just a joy in the hand. I'll be again reviewing it in depth, but I saw the original that it was based on. I think that Peter Johnson provided some of the detaels, so you had to do a lot of.
Kind enough to share his notes on that one.
Yeah, hang on. I don't know if I can promote. How can I promote Kyle to? I don't know if I can make you bigger in. I think that's as big as I can make your screen, Kyle. So can you show what? Look at this beast that you have there. Boy, am I jealous. Look at that.
That's a big one.
This is the next one I'm reviewing next Friday. My review of this will come out. The Type 17, an absolute beast of a sword. And I don't. Somebody said something that either Andy or Eric said something that really resonated with me with Eric's work. There's something authentic about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I talk about this in my review. Looking at this sword, I don't know of any other sword like this on the market.
Yeah.
Nobody makes Type 17s. Albion is really the only other people who make a Type 17. They have a very different take on it than this. But they're looking at it, the profile just screams authentic to me. It just looks right. And it's hard to say anything more than that. It just feels like it belongs. You know, there's a lot of swords that don't have that feel, and this one absolutely does.
And just to touch on both of those pieces, those are examples of why someone might come to me as opposed to another contemporary builder that does equally or better technical work. Both of those were research pieces. You know, there is, you know, both of those. The longsword wasn't based on a specific piece, but it was based on a very specific class of pieces.
Right.
You know, Clive has an article, something along the lines of like sharpened steel bars, referencing an Oakshott article. And, you know, there's that kind of research and that kind of time ultimately is something that goes into the cost of the swords. You know, it's and that's a difference between, say, the work that I do and the work that one of the major manufacturers does. You know, they might take an image, you know, some of the companies 15 years ago were very famous for this. You know, they'd get a catalog, either a museum catalog or an auction catalog, have one look, trace the outline, make a sword. I have no interest in working at that level of detail. So I want to, you know, even if I'm doing a totally new one-off Eric special version of a Type 17, you know, I'm going to research what the type is. I'm going to look at the span of known norms within that. If I want to push something like that one is a large, heavy war sword. They weren't all like that, but that was, so what is large and heavy and light and spindly mean in that classification? That level of research is something I'm interested in and something I can share with people that are purchasing product from me. If you don't have value in that, then, you know, maybe you like my stuff, maybe you like somebody else's stuff.
So just to bully everyone off the screen for a second. So here's one of the examples. So this is, again, working from some of Peter Johnson's information, and these are your own drafts for the Lijana Master. Yes.
So the image that's laid on there, that printout, is actually Peter's notes. So he was kind enough to basically share with me his notes from direct observation.
And again, to me, to bring that, because the original find you can see is in relic condition. It's not terrible, but it still requires a significant interpretation on first Peter and then your part. And to go from that to this to create a absolutely stunning piece that, again, you guys cannot feel that, because, you know, I'll be selfish here and bring up the dynamics that some crazy person came up with. But this little piece of sword just handles wonderfully in the hand. I can't get over this enough, how comfortable it is. That I described it as a little piece of steel that just is aching to do violence whenever I pick it up. It really just wants to go, but it is nimble and compact, and it really feels like it would do a tremendous amount of damage if you gave it the opportunity to. And all of that takes a whole lot of time to be able to go from just a pile of rust that someone found in Slovenia to be able to bring that back to life. That's spectacular.
Yeah.
The work that you did.
Yeah, and that was a place too where, so that one, I was fortunate to take a class with Peter at Zach's in New Hampshire, and I took a master class. That is not the sword I made during the class, but I was a bit of a go-getter and decided to make a second one in the evenings after class, where to me, that was a great way to cement what Peter was teaching me without having Peter sort of hands-on. That was a sort of after-hours project, and being able to really work from basically museum information and then process that through what I was learning from him and then my own experience. So there, I could go on about the similarities and differences between the museum piece and what was produced. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience and really helped sort of shape how I approach it.
Just a quick question from the Peanut Gallery. We have Aiden, who specifically asked if you had any interest in expanding your repertoire to make replicas from Chinese swords.
Possibly. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is, I've only got so many years of my life ahead of me, so it depends on how I split my focus. So I will say that I have a specific interest in Ottoman Turkish weaponry. I have an interest in various steppe culture swords going back kind of Bronze Age through sort of the late Mongol period. Stuff after that, my interest generally shifts more European at the moment. But yes and no. So with a lot of stuff, like I have a Shamshir blade I made probably a couple of years ago. I'm very happy with the blade, and I know that I, at this point, am not technically proficient enough in the decorative arts that I want to do with it. So rather than just finish it and shove it out the door, I'm sitting on it while I learn other things. And that's true for, especially some of the early, like ring-hilted Chinese swords, sort of early Iron Age stuff. That's more interesting to me. I guess developmental steps. So later things like Dao, potentially, but at this point, I have other things that are drawing my attention a little bit more strongly.
All right. If you ever develop a taste for gin, I'm sure that Aiden would be very interested in becoming a customer for you.
I have a huge interest in things like eight-sided blades, sort of octagonal cross sections.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in looking at, from sort of an academic standpoint, but also sort of the sort of creative scholastic side of things. I'm interested in looking at where some of the Bronze Age Chinese stuff, how that transitioned and possibly influenced things like early Roman eight-sided spatha and how that developed. It's real sword nerdery. But there's, for a long time, especially with all European studies, but European arms as well, a lot of development was looked at in isolation, when in reality we know that there were trade routes and there was cultural interaction going back much further than later Europeans wanted to admit. So a lot of that cross-pollination is interesting from a historical side, but also an artistic side. So we'll see what develops.
That's awesome. There was something I was going to say, but it has escaped my mind. That falchion is burning a hole through my through my pocket back there.
I could say, Eric, you were saying, the Turkish and the steppes. You're talking Andy's language right there.
Yeah, that was one of the first conversations we had, was about early Mongolian long cavalry sabers, which is, again, something I need to do a little more research on, but man, it's
there's a lot of there's a surprising amount of space to work within there. Like, I know that you say that you're more interested in like the pre-conquest era stuff, but even post-conquest stuff, there's some really wacky long sabers, like some of the Crimean Tartar sabers that have like the long dagger pointed. No one is making those sorts of things. Like I've tried a couple times to get those produced. Yeah,
Yeoman shapes and how they move across sort of Turkic influence into Hungary, and and how some of that. It's always easy to say one culture influenced another because of proximity. From a archival sort of inquiry, it'd be interesting to see how much independent development also happened. I'm terrible with languages. I kind of wish I could learn a Cyrillic language because there's a lot of good scholarship in Russian, Ukrainian.
Yeah, I've had to do a lot of like chicken pecking, and like some of the AI stuff is helping with some of those scholarly stuff that's locked behind Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian. But I've previously like manually translated with a dictionary in hand, and it's been slow going.
Better you than me. I wish I had the ability to still do that, but it's I just fell asleep.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Let's see what else. So I'm very impressed. Everything that you've sent out has come with this scabbard, and that really should not be overlooked, because there's plenty of makers that only will send you the naked blade, and I'm not going to fault them for that, but it's a skill to have in and of itself, to have something to cover the blade, and a tremendous amount of time from everyone that I've talked to. I've made one scabbard, so I have at least some idea of what goes into it, but my talent in scabbard making is leaves a lot to be desired compared to any of the work that you put together. It's hasn't fallen apart yet, right?
Yeah, it's on there. I think historically we're dealing with, we have independent artists in a modern context that are essentially building. That was a fun one. That took a little longer. That are basically doing what guilds and workshops did, and
exactly.
So my interest is, a sword is a great thing, but it's not a complete thing. In a modern context, if you've got a rifle that doesn't have a magazine, you don't have a functioning rifle, or a sling. That's things that are necessary and may or may not be weighted the same. And then I'm interested, if this goes beyond swords. If you can make it, there's a good chance I want to figure out how. At least as far as wood and metal objects. So scabbards, and same with I come from a knife maker's background.
Yeah,
you never would send a knife out, or at least you wouldn't send a hunting knife out without a sheath. You might send an art piece out, or some sort of like Quillon dagger or something. But for me, it never made sense to not complete it. And with swords, a scabbard. There are so many not good scabbards on production swords.
Yeah.
That if you're going to produce something at a high level, why leave it up to somebody else to finish it? That's kind of how I look at it. So I wanted to learn how to do that.
Kyle, you have more experience than I do with high-end swords, having scabbards, not having scabbards, as well as production swords and running the gamut with all sorts of scabbards. What's your take on what if you're getting a high-end sword? Would you prefer it have a scabbard? Would you not prefer it has a scabbard? And if it comes with one, do you have expectations for how good it should look, or do you just factor that into the total cost of the sword?
So to me, a sword isn't complete without a scabbard. So I really appreciate when I can, when the sword comes with one. If it's a high-end sword, it's really nice for it to come with a high-end scabbard, especially because it's the same artist, theoretically, making it. So there's that vision from start to finish, all in one piece. The scabbard's part of the sword, part of the project from the get-go, ideally, for me at least. So I love it when high-end makers include scabbards. They don't necessarily need to be fancy. I'm first one I pulled out, the Type 17, it's not a particularly fancy scabbard, but there's a cohesive vision with the sword and the rain shape, rain flap, whatever you want to call them. There's a cohesive vision there, and it really helps complete the sword. So personally, I absolutely love it when.
Yeah, and it's just from my own aesthetic and what I sort of with that. I do fancy work, and I do less fancy work. My hope is that the less fancy stuff is at least equally good to the fancy stuff. So there aren't grades of quality. There's grades of time, decoration, and you know, if somebody wants something bejeweled, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that the base bones of the object are higher or lower quality than something more basic. So yeah, I think that's, and kind of going to that point of how they're delivered. I certainly have no issue with people selling high-end swords without scabbards because they don't want them to be. They don't want to make them, or they don't want to deal with them, or whatever the issue is. If somebody is going to then buy a scabbard aftermarket for it, my hope would be that they buy something of equal and appropriate level so that the unit is cohesive. You know, it's or going the other way, buying a rock bottom sword and spending tons and tons of money to have a highly bespoke scabbard for it. That is equally an odd juxtaposition to me. That might just be my own artistic nerdery. So, yeah.
Well, I can say from the three you sent me, Eric, two of them pretty plain, one pretty fancy. All three absolutely outstanding scabbards.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
They are some of the best I've handled personally.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's also interesting too. You know, as a maker, I come from an interesting position where I've had a long interest in swords and sort of medieval Renaissance history and material history, but I've never been a reenactor. You know, I've never been a sort of open market sword collector. Like I've just never done those things. So I don't really even know what's out there. I mean, most of my experience is either with original museum pieces or with work from other folks that kind of doing what I'm doing. You know, I think one of the first swords I ever picked up that wasn't one of mine was one of Peter Johnson's. So, you know,
quite a yardstick to measure against.
Yeah, no, well, and that's the thing, right? Like, I think at least, you know, I think there are fabulousness out there. My hope is to continue to push to eventually get to whatever level one can top out in this. And I think that's important for somebody that is building in the artistic sense than I am. It's not a mandate, you know, certainly wasn't a historical mandate. There are plenty of swords that are as workmanlike as possible, that have survived for hundreds of years, thousands of years. But for my own interest, even for plain work, I want the quality to continue to improve and really sort of stand up on its own.
Yeah. So just to Alientude's point, so I'll just bring this falchion up. So the Italian falchion, which again, this is very difficult for me to not fall madly in love with this sword every time I pick it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, my wife will not appreciate that. But the handle, the grip is, again, it looks like something from a science fiction movie almost, just because of all the different lines and the details that are coming into it. And like you say, the scabbard is much more plain in its detailing, but it's very, very fine work. This is just very even, very nice, very consistent all the way down. I mentioned in my previous review that this shape is perhaps just tiny, slightly sticking out, but this is something that you could touch up in 2 seconds, I'm sure, and it'll be tucked nicely and neatly in there. So just absolutely great. And both of the other two obviously had a lot more attention, or I should say, had a lot more hours put into it with the design that was in all of the leather, which I don't even want to think about how much time you had to spend sweating over them.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. So, you know, I've mentioned that I'm in a place of luxury where if something doesn't the way I want it to be, I change it. It's, you know, I want to put out finished work the way I want to put it out. So that scabbard is actually take 2. There's another beautiful scabbard somewhere around here that the core is nice, the leather wrap's nice, the tooling's wonderful. But I decided the style of tooling was a little bit more modern, contemporary that I liked for the piece. And so I made another one, and that's what I went out with. And I'm fortunate and also maybe crazy to do that sort of thing. But, you know, they're too hard to make, and too much time is put in to worry about things like that. Like, okay, I don't like leather. Great. Pull it off, put a new one on. In that case, I decided that the scabbard was nice enough. I might just leave it around just as something kind of cool in the house, but it wasn't what I wanted for the piece. And then going back to the falchion scabbard, you know, I sent a Type 10 to Kyle. The clean work, simple work, there's no place to hide. So you can't really screw up too much and make it worthwhile. Like, I mean, that has both of those, and I don't know if they're coming up on camera or not. I'm just working off my phone here, but they're, you know, those parallel border lines and some of the antiquing and stuff in that. If those go wonky, you either decide you're okay with that or you make a new one. And in my case, it's fix it.
Yeah, I was going to say those lines down the side, the as you say, the antiquing, the final finish that it comes with, none of it is accidental, and you can tell that by the finished product when you're looking at it. This is not something that you can get, and you know, I'll talk about it in my own videos, but as it's something that I'll want to go over since I don't do commission pieces as much on my channel as someone else. Again, you know, Alientude, you've covered this topic before, but it's just, you have to do things like if someone if a place like the United States wanted to build a car from scratch, you know, we could do it, but that's the thing, like, we'd be making all the individual components. You'd be making the tires and the spark plugs and the windshield all from scratch, whereas that's not how things are done nowadays. And once upon a time, you'd have blades made by one guild, you'd have the cutlers doing one thing, you'd have the scabbards being produced, and so now we've reduced a smith to having to be masters of who knows how many different trades all simultaneously in order to bring these works of art to life. And then someone says, well, why am I paying, you know, $2,000 or $3,000 for a sword when I can buy something that's mass produced in India or China for $500 and it'll still cut the same water bottle? Right?
Yeah. Well, I had to paraphrase a friend of mine who is another sword maker, is you know, he said something along the lines of, you know, people come to us asking for products that were made for kings, and they want to pay nothing for them, you know, which I understand from a new collector, right? Like, if you're new to the market, you have no idea what a sword goes for, right? Yeah. So the fact that you can get a sword for $100 or $50, and you can get a sword for $100,000, like that's crazy if you're not familiar. But if you're I would say a mature collector, that's not to say that everybody should be able or can or should make, you know, I know the swords are kind of expensive. And that's fine. If it's too expensive, it's too expensive. You know, there are certainly products out in the market that I want that I can't afford. But I would say find something you like that you can't afford instead of asking somebody to dumb down their work, because then nobody will be happy.
No, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, these are luxury items.
Absolutely.
These are things that we are fortunate enough to be able to afford and share and appreciate, and hopefully, love and study and get some enjoyment out of. But they are not necessary for our day-to-day lives. And if you tried to ask a cobbler to reproduce a Reebok, he would not be able to do so for the price you'd get at Payless Shoes.
It's certainly not for Reebok pricing, right? Yeah, it's. I'm always amazed. I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
Looking again, I don't really. I've never been a sword collector, so the low end part of the market, I'm amazed that some factories can turn work out for them. In some cases, I wonder how they can. It's volume or not. It's amazing.
Yeah, there are certain sectors. I've tried to explain this to some folks because oftentimes the sword collecting market sword collecting community is fragmented, and they'll be very surprised at what quality their dollar will get in different fields, and different aspects of the hobby are more mature than others. So what level of quality you will expect for, let's say, $300 for a Japanese sword is completely different than if you're trying to buy an Ottoman sword, than if you're trying to buy a medieval sword.
Sure.
Because the levels of the industry are at completely different maturation. What's your opinion, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not much of a secret to most sword collectors that katana are the least expensive for decent quality you can get on the market, and that's because Longchuan in particular turns them out. They have entire industry dedicated to katana, basically, and so they have they put in that time, they've put in that effort to make their factories. I don't know the exact process. Obviously, I haven't been there, but they have streamlined the entire process and saved pennies everywhere they can, and in order to make a fully functional, not authentic, but fully functional and good enough to satisfy a huge part of the buying market. European swords are trailing there. They're making strides, especially in the past few years. There's been some really good strides. You're talking about, like you said, like a Killich or something like that.
Yeah.
There's almost none. They're still in the infancy.
Yeah. Well, and they're in the same place they were 20 years ago.
Right.
If you look at like sort of the windlass scimitar, it hasn't changed. Hasn't gotten better, hasn't gotten worse. It's exactly the same. It's without going too much into sort of politics and world markets and things, like just material costs alone. I mean, I can't imagine making myself a sword for $50. I mean, a chunk of blade steel for me is that, and that's before any work's been done or shipped to here. So it's just a different part of the market, and if people are satisfied with what they're getting, fantastic. I have no qualms with that. I certainly don't compete with that. I couldn't even try if I wanted to. It's just a very different version of sword collecting.
So to that end, Kyle touched on it earlier. You've made a Type 17, which Oakshot wrote off on his book as who would ever even want to pick up this sword because they're so dumb. But you have shown, and since then other academics have pointed out that there's elegance in this type of sword if you take the time to actually study the group. Is that something that you'd like? Because you and I have had these sort of conversations offline a little bit. There, to some degree, I feel that there are swords that continue to be produced over and over again. We will see, I don't know how many different versions of Type 14 arming swords. And yet there are gads of different types of swords out there that no one is touching. No one is producing them for whatever reason. And maybe it's rightfully so that if you go and look at the original and pick up the original, it's really cumbersome in the hand. It's really clunky. maybe it's only made for armored fighting, and no one has a horse to ride, no one has a full suit of armor, no one's stabbing each other, no one makes S-talks because everyone wants to chop water bottles, no one wants to try and run them through a wooden door. But is that an interest of you to perhaps be a little on the countercultural side and explore things that perhaps everyone else isn't doing?
I'm always interested in strange things, and certainly, well, it's interesting again, because I'm coming at this from an armchair researcher standpoint and an artistic standpoint. There's a certain amount of survivor bias in collections. Why did some things survive the last 1,000 years and 1,000 more common things didn't? So there's that. Things like S-stocks. I'm doing rapiers. You talk to people about test cutting with accurate point only rapiers, and they're like, "What do you mean? There's no test cut?" And it's like, well, I mean, you can stab things all day long with a filed sharp epic blade, and it's not going to be the same as a weight period correct, thrust centric, similar weight rapier. So there's that kind of academic side of things where I'm interested in they made them. Why'd they make them? Let's see what was effective enough for this to last 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000, depending on the style of implement. But yeah, things like that 17. There's a huge variety of 17s. So for Oakshott, there's a lot to praise about Oakshott's work. Technical accuracy is not always there, and so his love and desire for certain swords, I treat like mine, right? It's a bias. It's your own bias. There were things he liked, there were things he didn't like. The things he didn't like, clearly other people did. So why? And so looking again at like Clive's article on where he studied a variety through several armories, through multiple collections, looking at, and this is a place where experience making these things helps. So, if you look at things like, well, it has a 34-inch blade and the whole thing weighs this much compared to one that's got a 35-inch blade and it weighs this much. I have enough experience where I can start to extrapolate why that is and how things are different in sort of those micro sections.
Yeah.
And that level of understanding and I mean, it helps me tease things out. So with that sword in particular, I knew that I wanted to push a certain end of armored fighting class sword, which as a rule isn't reproduced anymore because people aren't putting on armor and bashing people about anymore. Like it's not, that does happen in a sporting context, but they're not doing it with historically accurate live weapons. And so, it's comparing that to maybe the same sword designed for unarmored dueling context. It's going to weigh differently. It's going to balance differently. I mean, that sword is a pretty stout. I'm not going to call it an unsharpened bar of steel as we're on here, but it is on the heavier, bigger end of a fighting sword. And then you go to half sword it, and it's a totally different beast. There's a reason the weight's different. If you're gripping the sword 2 feet down from the cross, it's going to handle differently, and it's not going to handle inelegantly. It's just going to be a different thing. And I have a sword that I'm working on now that is essentially the same realm of armored fighting sword, but predominantly by differences in where and how mass is distributed through the blade, a little bit through the hardware, but mostly the blade. It's a very different sword in hand. And that kind of, I have another one over here that I've got planned, another 16 that, again, a sort of armored class war sword, which again is going to be strikingly different than the first two. And on paper, they all look like essentially big heavy bats, but in reality, they're not. And they're also, where they're elegant and where they move well, it is not the same as maybe the same type 17, the same type 16 in a civilian context.
Yeah.
Especially a late Renaissance civilian context. if you're comparing a sword from 1450 to a sword from 1570, they're owned by different people. They're used in different ways. They might have quite a bit in similar sort of visual layout. And again, that's what we're looking at catalogs from the one view. It doesn't tell you the full story. So, and I'm in a position where I can say, hey, that is kind of strange, and nobody's making it. Why? and make one that I think doesn't suck. That's the hope.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. That's wonderful. Kyle, I'm not going to make you spoil all of your review, but have you handled a different Type 17 before?
I have a customized Albion Type 17.
Okay, so you
yeah.
have at least.
They're normal Type 17s, and they are just wildly different. They are on the dueling sword style of sword.
Well, and those two swords are almost half a foot different in length too. So
they're just completely different design goals.
Yeah, and there's like a pound difference. I mean, it's like they're you hold them up, and Oakshot's typology is fantastic because it helps us have a common language.
Yeah.
I think that the danger of folks that rely on a typology, and this goes to some of the production swords as well, where they're treating it as a textbook. It's not. It's guidelines. It's a typology. It's describing certain physical characteristics so that we can have a common conversation. It's not saying that all Type 16s. I mean, you look at a 16A and a 16E. They're not the same sword. They just have similar attributes, So yeah.
That's great.
I think a good way to put it, or one way to look at it, is that the Oakshot typology can be good for describing like the profile and the construction method almost, but not the handling. Because there's wild handling differences within the same typology.
Yeah, or even, and things that are, you could have a wheel pommel, and from 3 feet away, it looks exactly like the wheel pommel next to it. It has maybe a 30% mass difference, and it's going to radically change the same sword. So it's, without getting too much in the weeds of that, there's a lot of places on these things that you can change how they feel and how they behave. And that's one of the things that, again, going to a smith like me, meaning I started at a certain price point that's higher than a lot of the commercial market. I can take the time, rather than knocking out another Type 17, for instance, I can build a Type 17 that is part of a sword as opposed to building to a type. So that sword, I'm going to, as I grind the blade, I'm going to, pay attention to where and how it flexes, where that mass is in balance to the parts that aren't even attached to it yet. And really that time and that attention to fine tune a specific object to a purpose is a big difference. And again, some people find value in that, some people don't. I do. So I spend the time doing it.
Excellent way to put it. We're coming up on the hour mark. I'm going to keep us on for a couple. If anyone needs to drop out, by all means, drop out. I'm going to keep us on for just a couple more minutes. If anyone, I see we have a couple viewers, so if anyone has questions for Eric or myself or Kyle, please drop them in the chat. I'm going to pull the falchion out just because I have it and I love looking at it. So, was this based off of any one thing in mind, or did you come up with this kind of on your own?
Yes, it's based on a few things. One, there is a museum example that I found after I started that is similar. I have questions about the museum example that I have not been able to answer. I'll just leave it at that. I was interested in sort of some of the Doge Palace backswords, and then also the purported Castellan falchion. And so I wanted to look at something that was and sort of that pommel typology, which is shared between the Doge swords and the Castellan work. Certainly the falchion. We know there were a lot of Venetian and North Italian imports into that area. So I was curious at looking at what a hypothetical would be for something later than Castellan, but contemporary to other falchions that we have that mix very North Italian styles. Really getting into the weeds of the geekery.
I was going to say the fuller configuration, the type Elmsley 3C style blade. It does remind me very much of a Venetian take on the otherwise Castillon falchion find, because you get Italian falchions that what I would call storta, so late period Italian falchions that we have surviving, but they are kind of later. They're more like 16th century type stuff.
Well, a lot of stuff is very different.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So those are quite distinct from proper medievally style falchions.
I'm working on one. I'll show it to you later.
Yeah. Let's take a look at what you got
later down the road. I'll send that to you. I'm a couple weeks out. I'm finishing.
So obviously, James Elmsley is chasing down every single-edged medieval sword under the sun, but they're very few and far between. So for one to have this collection of features, there's plenty of artistic examples that this would kind of correspond to. For there to be an extant that would have something like this would be really exciting to find. Again, it sounds like there might be something.
I'd love to. Yeah,
it sounds like there's probably a couple museum pieces that might be worth checking out.
There's one that is very similar, but I have a lot of questions about at least how it's presented. So I don't know. Well, I mean, I'll be blunt. I don't know if it's an authentic sword. Which, there are plenty of museums that have forgeries or swords presented out of context. If it's an authentic sword, which it very well, maybe it is. I haven't seen it, and I'm not the end all be all expert on that. I'm new to that level of study. But if it's authentic, I'm not sure it fits into how it was presented. And the provenance and who owns it and who's loaned it to the museum, and there's a lot of back scholarship that could be done there. And it doesn't look exactly like that anyway, but it was it was close enough that I'm clearly not the first person to have that idea, and that was exciting to me. So,
remind me later. I won't be able to look it up on the stream, but there was one that's probably of Italian make that I recently discovered for James in a Russian museum that's of exceptional preservation. Again, it's the provenance is not well established, but it's still a very interesting looking sword and worth taking a glance or two at.
Good.
Any parting remarks, Mr. Alientude?
I would just say check out Eric's work. You have to. Not everybody can afford it. I mean, there's a sticker shock at looking at his work. There's no doubt about it. They're not inexpensive swords. But if you have a project that you think would go well, but would fit well with him, reach out to Eric. He's a great guy to talk to. Also, he's very much a sword nerd, as many of us are. So even if you end up not commissioning something from him, you might just end up having a great chat.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm certainly happy to talk to folks about work they're interested in that they want to tire kick that they're not 100% committed to. I don't necessarily want to spend 3 weeks talking about a project somebody's not committed to, but if somebody has an idea and they just want to get a ballpark of what it would be for me to help them bring that around, reach out, let me know, and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything else that we're specifically talking about swords? Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that you covered? Like, for instance, you did some side work for me on the side. Is there anything else? We do knives. I mean, like, I don't study knives, so I don't think in terms of knives.
No, sure. So In the historic realm of things, I certainly do like a full range of daggers. Pretty much anything, any European dagger, with the exception of sort of the highly decorated. I'll do ear daggers, but some of the stuff where it's like full cutlery and shell inlay and things like that, I just don't have the technical skills for. But if you want a rondelle or a wire wrap parrying dagger or something at a high level, that let me know. So that stuff is fun. I do kitchen knives. I do, pocket fixed blades for sort of everyday carry type of stuff. I do a range of archery leather accessories.
This is a very colorful knife.
Yeah. That was the Miami Slice.
Great name.
So that's an ABL knife with Kydex and synthetic materials for the handles. And I'm going to be doing a knife coming up for a gentleman that he wanted. He really liked Gladius and Pugio, but he's not going to walk around with a Roman dagger strapped to his belt. So I'm going to do basically a pocket-sized fixed blade that's based on that. So I have a wide range of stuff that I do. Rapiers, side swords. Man, I love side swords. I love weird things like late period Storta. If people want to get weird on early 15th century sabers and look at some of the funky Hungarian stuff, I mean, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not on the list. It's like everybody, we're limited by partially what sells and partially what I've had time to work on. But I mean, if you want to get weird, let me know. Let's get weird. There's plenty of fun stuff that was popular that is hard to make in a production setting, so you don't see it.
Right.
And Storta are a great place for that. Falchions are a great place. Like there's complexities and there's subtleties that don't align well with mass production, so you're not going to see them as often. It doesn't mean that it's outside of my skill set. It just means somebody's testing.
Do you think that is part of the reason that there are so few historically accurate falchions out there? Do you think that it's that research has not been done on them, or do you think that they are a technically difficult sword to execute
all of the above. So single-edged swords in general are going to be more difficult to do batch heat treating on. And I'm not talking like one sword. I'm talking like 100 swords.
Right.
So when you're doing stuff like that, if you're getting sabering in the wrong direction, you're out 100 swords, and that's much bigger. So there is some of that. A lot of it too. I've worked in bike factories, so I'm going to base my experience on factory experience doing that. If it's not going to sell in enough volume to justify, then you have to wonder why you're carrying the model. And if you are trying to tap into a new market, if you're like, I don't know, if you're production company B and you want to start making falchions, but nobody's making them, well, am I going to spend time trying to make something that nobody's doing, or am I going to make another single-handed arming or like long-handled Viking sword that I know 1,000 of? So, like people are buying them, let's make those, right? So I have the flexibility to make weird stuff that other people wouldn't want to make from a time management and a resource management standpoint. It doesn't mean the object isn't a totally viable, collectible, rad thing. It just, maybe it doesn't make sense to make 1,000 of them, so nobody's making any of them.
All right. Excellent answer. Okay, well, I think we have run about 10 minutes longer than we originally intended to. Hopefully that is okay with everyone. But this was a wonderful talk. And again, Eric, I think that we'll probably be talking again at some point in the future. Hopefully we got a lot out of this. Hopefully everyone who watched this got a lot out of it. I know I learned a lot just talking to you. Kyle, it's always great to have you on the channel. Hopefully you and I will get to continue chatting more going forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I certainly know that you guys have had that stuff, some of the demos that I sent out. If you want to chat more either online or offline, or you have questions or whatever, just reach out. I'm easy.
Sounds good. Well, I know certainly on this channel we'll be seeing reviews. There'll be one review coming out for one of the Winter Cutlery swords very shortly. The other two will be coming less shortly, just because I have a couple other things coming up. Alientude, when do we have one coming up for you sometime pretty soon, right?
Well, next Friday will be my first review, and then the next two will be spaced out over the next couple months.
All right, so
Okay.
Alientude, I think, will probably be the first out the gate, so we can all meet on his channel to watch his review on Friday. So thank you, everyone, for being on tonight. I wish you guys a great rest of your weekend. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.